reading Cervantes' Don Quixote. Chapter 4. On what happened to our knight once he left the inn. It must have been around dawn when Don Quixote rode out of the inn, feeling so gallant, so exceedingly ecstatic at finally being knighted, that the magnitude of his delight nearly busted the cinch off his saddle. But recalling his host's advice about stocking up on the necessary precautions, money and clean undershirts in particular, he decided to head back home and outfit himself fully with all the provisions, including a squire. He had a neighbor in mind, a farmer who, though he was poor and he did have kids, would make a perfectly fine squire. With that thought, Don Quixote returned Rocinante toward their town. The nag, as if recognizing the road back to his stables, began to trot so eagerly his hooves scarcely seemed to touch the ground. They hadn't gotten far, when off to the right, in the thicket of a forest that lined the road, Don Quixote thought he heard a sort of delicate shouting, like someone crying out. As soon as the sound reached his ears, he said, "I raise my thanks to heaven for the mercy granted me in so swiftly offering me opportunities to practice my profession and pluck the fruit of my fine desires. This shouting must surely be coming from some needy sir, or indeed lady, in dire need of my favor and assistance." Tugging on Rocinante's reins, he turned the horse in the direction he thought the shouting was coming from. He was only a few steps into the forest when he spotted a mare tied to an oak and a boy tied to another, all of 15 years old, stripped naked from the waist up. He was the one who'd been shouting, and not without reason, for a fine-looking farmer was whipping him over and over with a belt, punctuating each blow with a reproachful advice. He was saying, "A silent tongue and a watchful eye," and the boy was crying, "I won't do it again, Signor. For the love of God, I won't do it again. I promise from now on I'll be more careful with the flock." Seeing this, Don Quixote called out in a lofty voice, "Discourteous knight, it is unseemly to do battle with those who cannot defend themselves. Mount thy horse and take up thy lance," because there was a lance leaning against the oak where the mare was tied, "and I shall show you how your actions are the stuff of cowards." The farmer, who looked up to see a bizarre-armed figure practically on top of him, brandishing a lance in his face, thought he was as good as dead. Carefully crafting his response with fine words, he replied, "Senior Knight, this boy I'm punishing is a servant of mine. He's supposed to watch the flock of sheep I keep in these parts, but he's so careless, I'm losing a sheep a day. And even though I'm only punishing him for his negligence, or perhaps his treachery, he claims I'm doing it to get out of paying him the salary I owe him, which I swear to God on my soul is a lie." "Lie? You dare say the word lie in my presence, loathsome villain?" bellowed Don Quixote. In this context, villain means a serf or feudal tenant. "By the sun that shines upon us, I'm on the verge of breaking every inch of your body with this lance. Pay him quickly, and without further argument. If you do not, by Almighty God, I shall annihilate and end you on the spot. Free him immediately." The farmer bowed his head and untied his servant without a word. Don Quixote asked the boy how much his master owed him, and he replied 9 months at a rate of 7 reals a month. Don Quixote did the math and found out it came to 73 reals. What? That's not... Okay. He told the farmer to hand them over immediately, unless he wished to choose this as his hill to die on. The chicken-hearted villain replied that by the path he walked and by the vow he'd taken, though hadn't taken any vows, he didn't know the boy as much as he said, because he had to take into account and deduct the 3 pairs of shoes the boy had gone through, plus another rill to pay for the 2 bloodlettings that had to do for him when he was sick. "That's all well and good," replied Don Quixote, "but he rendered his payment for the shoes and the bloodletting when you lashed him without reason. For if he bore holes in the soles of his shoes, you bore holes on his hide when you whipped him. And if the barber drew off blood when he was sick, you've now drawn his blood when he was sound. Therefore, and on that account, he owes you nothing." "The trouble is, Signor Knight, I don't have a blanca on me, Let Andres come back to my house with me, and I shall be sure to pay him hand over fist." "Me? Go with him?" cried the boy. "Fat chance! No, senor, I don't even want to think about it, because as soon as we're alone, he'll flay me like San Bartolome." "He'll do no such thing," replied Don Quixote. "For if I command him not to, he shall respect me and obey. And if he swears to me on his vow of chivalry, I shall let him go free and ensure he pays your salary." "Your Grace, senor, look what you're saying," said the boy. "There's nothing chivalrous about my master. He's no knight. He's Juan Dubious the Rich, who lives in Quintanar." "That matters not," replied Don Quixote, "for there may be knights even among the dubious, since each man is the child of his deeds." "That's very true," said Andres. "For what kind of deeds is my master the child of, when he refuses to pay me my salary after I've given him my sweat and my labor?" "I'm not refusing, brother Andres," responded the farmer. "And if you'll do me the pleasure of accompanying me, I swear on every vow of chivalry in the whole wide world that I'll pay you, just like I said, hand over fist, with a cherry on top." "You may forego the cherry," said Don Quixote. "Simply give him what he owe him in coin, and I shall be content. And be sure to do as you've sworn. Otherwise, by that self-same vow, I swear to come back to find and punish you, even if you skitter off like a lizard to hide. And should you wish to know the name of he who so commands you, that my true identity may compound the compulsion you feel to fulfill your promise, know that I am the gallant Don Quixote of La Mancha, righter of wrongs and of reasonlessness. Go with God, and let what you have promised and sworn stray not from your thoughts, on pain of the pain I've promised." Saying this, he spurred Rocinante and rode off. The farmer watched him go. Once Don Quixote had left the forest and could no longer be seen, he turned back to his servant Andres and said, "Come here, my boy, and let me give you what I owe you, just as the righter of wrongs commanded." "I swear," said Andreas, "you Grace better follow through and do as that fine knight, may he live 1,000 years, commanded you. He's so brave and such a good judge, by God. If you don't pay me, he should have come back and punished you just like he promised." "Oh, I swear too," said the farmer. "But since I am so much love for you, I want to rack up some more debt to pay you back all the more." And wrenching the boy around by the arm, the farmer tied him to the oak once more and lashed the youth until he was at death's door. "Go on, Senor Andres," the farmer laughed. "Go call your righter of wrongs. You'll see how he won't right this one. Though I think I'm not done wronging you just yet, because I've got an itch to flay you alive, just as you feared." But in the end, he untied the boy and let him go off in search of his judge, in hopes the knight would execute his promised punishment. Andres left somewhat sulkily, swearing he'd find the valiant Don Quixote of La Mancha and tell him point by point everything that had happened after he'd left, and his master would have to pay him what he owed, and with interest too. But even so, Andres limped away crying, while his master stayed to laugh and laugh. And so Don Quixote righted his first wrong. He was quite content with how things had gone, for it seemed to him he had gotten his chivalry off to a felicitous and noble start. Thoroughly pleased with himself, he rode on toward his village, murmuring, "I may rightly call yourself the most fortunate woman alive. You may rightly call yourself the most fortunate woman alive, O beauty of beauties, Dulcinea of Toboso, for you have the fortune of having captured and bent to thy every will and whim such a valiant and renowned knight as is, and shall be, Don Quixote of La Mancha, who, as everyone knows, yesterday received the Order of Chivalry, and today has righted the worst wrong ever wrought by reasonlessness or committed by cruelty. For today he wrestled the lash from the hand of a merciless enemy who was senselessly thrashing a delicate youth." As he was talking, he came to a four-way fork in the road. In his imagination, he saw the great crossroads where knight-errants would pause and ponder which path to follow. Following their lead, he sat there for a while in silence. After pondering it quite well, he loosened Rocinante's rein and let the nag choose the path. Rocinante continued the way he had been going, following the road back to his barn. After about 2 miles, Don Quixote came across a great throng of people who, it later came to light, were a group of merchants from Toledo on their way to Murcia to buy some silk. There was 6 of them, well equipped with sunshades fixed to their saddles, alongside 4 servants on horseback and 3 mule boys leading the pack animals on foot. As soon as Don Quixote spied them in the distance, He imagined a new adventure was upon him. He wanted a chance to imitate the passos he had read about, where knights would guard a bridge or other pass, challenging whosoever wished to cross. Here was the perfect opportunity for what he had in mind. And so, with genteel countenance and full of daring, he settled his feet in his stirrups, grasped his lance, brought his shield to his chest, and stationing himself in the middle of the road, waited for all those distant knights, since that is what he took them for and judged them to be, to arrive. When they were close enough to see and hear him, Don Quixote raised his voice and with an arrogant air shouted, "None shall pass unless all confess that in all the world no damsel is more beauteous than that Empress of La Mancha, the peerless Dulcinea of Toboso." The merchants stopped cold at the sound and sight of the bizarre figure before them. They could tell he was a lunatic by his reasoning and his outfit, but they wanted to figure out what this confession he was demanding was all about. One of the merchants, who was a bit of a rascal, and was known for his deadpan wit, responded, "Señor Knight, we don't know this fine lady you're referring to. Show us, for if she is as beautiful as you say, we will happily and freely confess the fact as you request." "If I showed her to you," replied Don Quixote, "what good would there be in your confessing such an evident truth? The important thing is to believe, confess, affirm, swear, and defend her beauty without seeing her. Otherwise you shall do battle with me, you colossal and arrogant men. Whether you come at me one by one, as the order of chivalry decrees, or all at once, as is the nasty habit of your type, here I wait and await thee, and it with faith that I am in the right and reason is on my side." "Señor Knight," responded the merchant, "on behalf of all us princes you see here before you, I beg you, spare our consciences the burden of confessing something about someone we've never seen nor heard of, especially since the confession you require casts the Empress and Queens of Alcara and Estremadura in such a bad light. If your grace would just show us a portrait of the lady, even if it is no bigger than a grain of wheat, for as they say, enough's as good as a feast, we will surely be satisfied, and your grace will be content and have your confessions as recompense. I'd even go so far as to say we're so firmly on your side that even if the portrait shows that she's cross-eyed and oozes brimstone and vermilion, just to make you happy, we'll still praise her any way you like." "She does not ooze, you vile miscreant," cried Don Quixote, aflame with rage. "She does not ooze, I say, whatever it was you said. She oozes amber and delicate musk. She is neither cross-eyed nor crooked nor hunchbacked in any way, but straighter and more upright than a Guadarrama spindle." Hardwood spindles, implements of spinning wool for this region, were particularly prized. "You shall pay dearly for your great blasphemy against my gem of a lady." As he bellowed this, he lowered his lance and charged the man who had spoken. Don Quixote was so full of rage and fury that if luck had not led Rocinante to trip and fall before our knight had gotten halfway there, things would have gone quite badly for the impertinent merchant. But Rocinante fell, and so his master went rolling off into the countryside. He tried to get up, but could not, weighed down as he was by the lance, shield, spurs, and helmet, not to mention the pounds and pounds of ancient armor. As he struggled and failed to rise, he hollered, "Flee not, you cowards, you slaves! Mark that my horse and not I is to blame for the fact that here I lie." One of the mule boys, who must not have been entirely guileless, couldn't stand hearing the fallen knight's arrogance without leaving a response on his ribs. He walked over to where Don Quixote lay, yanked the lance out of his hands, and after breaking it to pieces, began beating the knife with a chunk of his own lance. He hit him so many times that even with his armor to protect him, Don Quixote was beaten to a pulp. The mule boy's master shouted at him, saying, "Enough already, and let him go." But the mule boy had his ace in hand, and he wasn't going to fold until he wagered the rest of his rage, so he picked up the other pieces of the broken lance and beat the miserable fallen knight with them until they split into splinters. And even with that torrent of blows raining down on him, not once did Don Quixote shut his mouth, shouting threats at the earth and the sky and at the ruffians, which is how he saw the merchants. Eventually the mule boy wore himself out, and the merchants went on their way. laden with enough gossip of the poor thrash knight to last them the rest of their trip. As soon as he was alone, Don Quixote tried again to see if he could stand. But if he could not do it hale and healthy, how could he manage it beaten and broken? And still he counted himself lucky, because it seemed to him that this was exactly the kind of misfortune that befell knights-errants. So he blamed it all on his horse and lay there, unable to get up, too black and blue to move. Chapter 5, which continues the story of our knight's misfortune. Well, once he realized he was not going to be able to wriggle his way upright, Don Quixote turned to his usual solution, which was to think of some passage in his books. His madness brought him the memory of the old ballad of Voldevinos and the Marquis of Mantua, when Carlotta left him wounded in a thicket, that timeless tale which the children know by heart, adolescents are aware of, and old men celebrate and believe to be history, even though it's about as true as the miracles of Muhammad. The tale seemed tailor-made for the situation Don Quixote found himself in, and so, full of pathos, he began to roll around on the ground and shout, with weakened breath, the very same words that wounded knight was said to have sung in the forest. "Where are you, my lady, that my agony fails to wound thee? Either you are unaware I lie here like this, or, Signora, you are false and treacherous." And he kept on singing the ballad until he got to the verse that goes, "O noble Marquis of Mantua, my uncle and my blood lord." As luck would have it, just as Don Quixote was singing this verse, a neighbor of his, a farmer from the same town, happened to pass by on his way back from the mill, where he had gone to drop off a load of wheat. Seeing a man laid out flat on the ground, the farmer went over to him, asking who he was, what hurt, and why he was singing such a sad lament. Don Quixote believed without a doubt this must be the Marquis of Mantua, his uncle, and so his only response was to keep singing the ballad, where he related his misfortune and the love between his wife and the emperor's son, following the lyrics to the word. The farmer was dumbstruck to hear such nonsense. Lifting up the visor, which was in pieces from the beating, he wiped Don Quixote's dust-caked face. As soon as he had cleaned him off, the farmer recognized him. He said, "Signor Quixote," for that must have been his name back when he was still sane, before he had changed from a placid gentleman to a knight-errant. "Who's left your grace in such a state?" But Don Quixote just kept on going with his ballad, singing in response to every question the farmer asked. The good man did his best to unbuckle the breastplate and the backplate to see if Don Quixote had a wound that needed tending, but he did not spot any blood or broken skin. He tried to lift him up off the ground, and with more than a bit of work, the farmer managed to get Don Quixote on top of his donkey, which seemed like the calmer steed. He picked up the armor, and even the splinters of broken lance, bundled them all up, and tied them onto Rocinante. With the horse's rein in one hand and the donkey's halter in the other, the farmer headed back to town, ruminating on the nonsense Don Quixote had been spouting. Our knight was no less pensive. Bruised and broken, he kept sliding off the burrow, and every so often he would heave a sigh so loud it seemed he was trying to reach the ears of heaven, until the farmer felt obliged to ask him again where he was hurting. Well, the devil himself must have been supplying Don Quixote with stories to fit his situation, because at that point, forgetting all about Voldevinos, he remembered what the Moor Abedarnarez had said when the governor of Antequera, Rodrigo de Novaes, had taken him captive and brought him shackled to his castle. And so, when the farmer again asked him how he was doing and where it hurt, Don Quixote replied with the very same words and reasons the captive Rahe? I'm terrible with these Spanish pronunciations. Used when responding to Rodrigo de Narvaez, according to what he had read in Jorge de Montemayor's La Diana, where the story appears, which is a pastoral bestseller in the period. Later editions included the Aben Karaha as an interpolated text, whatever that means. Interesting. It suited his situation So perfectly that the farmer spent a good stretch of road swearing under his breath and having to hear that whole machinery of idiocy. And so he realized his neighbor had gone mad and hurried to town, eager to unload the aggravation Don Quixote was causing him with his lengthy harangue. When he had finally finished, Don Quixote continued, saying, "Your Grace should know, Señor Don Rigo de Nave, that the beautiful Harifa, of whom I speak, is at present the lovely Dulcinea of Toboso, for whom I have performed, am performing, and shall perform the most amazing, famous feats of chivalry the world has or will see." To this the farmer replied, "Look, Señor, your Grace, sinner that I am not Don Rodrigo de Narvaez, or the Marquis of Mantua, but Pedro Alonso, your neighbor. Ugh. And your Grace isn't Valdovinos or Abadores either, but the honorable gentleman, Señor Quijana." "I know who I am," replied Don Quixote, "and I know who I can be, which is not only those I've said, but also the 12 peers of France, and even the 9 worthies." Interesting. "For all their deeds, singly and combined, shall surely be surpassed by mine." And I went on like that until they arrived, which was around dusk. The farmer waited on the outskirts of town until it got a bit darker, so folks wouldn't see the pulverized gentleman on such a lowly steed. Well, once the farmer figured it was dark enough, he walked into town and right up to Don Quixote's house, which he found in chaos. The town's priest and barber, great friends of Don Quixote's, were inside, and the housekeeper was shouting, "How do you like that, Señor Pastor Pero Perez?" For that was the priest's name. "The misfortune of my master. 3 days we haven't seen him, head or tail of him, or the nag, or the shield, or the lance, or the armor. Wretched me! Now I realize, and this is the truth, just as I was born to die, those damn books of chivalry he keeps and reads all the time has gone and broken his brain. How many times did I hear him talking to himself, saying he wanted to be a knight-errant, he'd travel the world in search of adventures? Satan and Barabbas take those books. They've ruined the finest mind in all La Mancha." The niece was saying the same, and more. "You should know, Señor Barber, Surgeon Nicholas," which was the barber's name. "Many times my senior uncle would stay up reading those soulless books of misadventure for 2 days straight and 2 nights too, and then he'd fling the books from his hand, grab his sword, and start stabbing the walls. And when he was all worn out, he'd say he'd just killed 4 giants the size of 4 towers, and the sweat from all that running around was blood from the grave wounds he'd received in battle. And then he'd drink a big jug of cold water and go back to being calm and sane, saying it was a priceless beverage that the wizard Mervin had given him, a grand old sage and friend of his. It's all my fault. I should have told your graces about my senior uncle's nonsense sooner, and you could have made him better before it came to this. Burned all those wicked books. He's got a lot that fully deserve to burn like heretics at the stake." "I agree completely," said the priest, "and by my faith, before tomorrow ends, I shall give those books a public hearing and condemn them to the flames, so that no one else may read them and go on to do what my fine friend must have done." Don Quixote and the farmer could hear all this clearly, and so the farmer finally understood his neighbor's ailment. He began to shout, "Your graces, open up for Señor Marquis of Mantua and Señor Valdovinos, who's gravely wounded, and for the more Señor Abadares, captive of the valiant Rodrigo de Narvaez, governor of Antequera." As soon as they heard him, everyone rushed outside. They recognized their friend, master, and uncle, who still hadn't gotten off the donkey because he couldn't, and they all ran over to embrace him. Don Quixote said, "Halt, for I am gravely wounded, and it's my horse who's to blame. Take me to my bed, and call, if possible, for the sage Pisabote, that she may examine and heal my wounds." "Speak of the devil," said the housekeeper. "See, my heart told me true. I know which leg my poor lord limps on. I'll take you upstairs, your grace. Happy to do it. We can patch you up right here. No need to call any busybodies. I'll say it once and 100 times over. Damn those books of chivalry for leaving your grace in such a state." They carried him to bed, and examining his wounds, they found there were none to find. Don Quixote told them that he was merely bruised from a great fall he had taken from his horse, Rocinante, while battling 10 behemoths more immense and impudent than almost any in the land. Said the priest. Now we've got behemoths in the mix. I swear on my vows, I'll burn those books tomorrow before the sun goes down. They asked Don Quixote 1,000 questions, and he would not answer a single one. He just asked them to give them something to eat and let him sleep, for that is what he needed most. They did so, and the farmer informed the priest in abundant detail about the state Don Quixote had been in when he found him. He told the priest everything, from the nonsense he'd been spouting when he was flat on his back to the strange things he said on the way home. This further sharpened the priest's desire to do what he did the next day, which was to call on his friend, the barber surgeon Nicholas, and go over with him to the house of Don Quixote. Ooh, fighting the windmills and a choleric Bacchaean. Oh, we've made a jump. It's now, I think, is it chapter 7? Yeah, we've made a jump. It was chapter 5. Now it's chapter 7. On the second foray of our good knight Don Quixote of the Mancha. Don Quixote spent 15 days calmly in his home, without showing any signs of wanting to second the experience of his first dalliance. He passed the time in delightful discussions with his two compadres, the priest and the barber, telling them what the world needed most was knights errant, and that he would be the one to revive errant chivalry. Sometimes the priest argued with him, and sometimes he conceded the point, for without such a stance there was no dealing with Don Quixote. Over the course of those days, our knight also solicited the services of a neighbor of his, a peasant and a nobleman, if that title can be given to a poor man, though not the sharpest tool in the shed. In short, Don Quixote said so many things, promising and persuading him so much that the poor villain agreed to join in his adventure, in his journey, and to serve as his squire. Among other things, Don Quixote told him he could ride forth in good spirits, for they just might come across an adventure that would lead them to win, in the blink of an eye, some insula or another, which he could rule over as governor. With these promises, and others like them, Sancho Panza, for that was the peasant's name, left his wife and children and signed on to be his neighbor's squire. Don Quixote gave the order to raise some funds, and by selling this and pawning that and hawking everything for a fraction of its worth, they managed to scrape up a reasonable sum. Don Quixote also outfitted himself with a buckler shield he borrowed from a friend. Refurbishing his broken visor the best he could, he told his squire the day and time he planned to set out so that Sancho could attend to any necessary arrangements. Above all, Don Quixote entrusted him with the task of bringing saddlebags. Sancho said he'd bring some, and he'd bring a very fine donkey to match, because he wasn't much one for walking. The donkey business gave Don Quixote a bit of pause, as he wondered if he could recall ever hearing of a knight-errant with an asinine squire. None came to mind. Nevertheless, he decided to allow it, under the premise that they would outfit Sancho with a more honorable mount as soon as the occasion presented itself, by seizing the horse of the first discourteous knight they came across. Don Quixote provisioned himself with underskirts and everything else he could find in accordance with the innkeeper's advice. Once all that was arranged and attended to, without Panza saying goodbye to his children or his wife, nor Don Quixote to his housekeeper or his niece, they set out one night without being seen. They rode so far through the night that by dawn they were sure nobody would find them, even if somebody were to look. Sancho Panza was riding high on his donkey, feeling like a patriarch with his saddlebags and his wineskin, bursting with desire to see himself named governor of the insula his master had promised. Don Quixote happened to follow the same route and rode as his first journey, winding his way through the countryside of Montiel, albeit somewhat less sorrowfully than before, for the morning sun rays shone at a gentler angle and did not beat down quite as hard. As they rode along, Sancho Panza said to his master, "Look, Your Grace, Señor Knight-errant, don't forget about that insula you promised me. I'll know how to govern it, no matter how big it is. To which Don Quixote replied, "You should know, Sancho Panza, my friend, that it was quite a common practice amongst the errant knights of yore to install their squires as governors of the insulas or kingdoms they won along the way, and I am determined that such a gratifying custom shall not be lost on my account. Moreover, I plan to go even further, for these ancient knights sometimes, perhaps even most of the time, waited until their squires were old, and only after they were worn out from service, from bad days and worse nights, would the squires receive the title of count, or at most marquis, of some little valley or province or another. But if you live and I live, it could well be that before 6 days have passed, I will have won such a kingdom as will have other kingdoms attached to it, which would be perfect for crowning you king of one. Marvel not, for such occasions and situations present themselves to us knights in ways that have never before been seen or imagined. So much so that I could easily end up giving you even more than I have promised." "If that happens," replied Sancho Panza, "if by some miracle I became king like your grace says, that would mean Juana Gutierrez, my old lady, would be queen, and my kids would be infantes." What's that? Titles given to children of Iberian monarchs. "Who could doubt it?" said Don Quixote. "Me, I doubt it," said Sancho, "because if you ask me, even if God rained kingdoms down on earth, no crown would sit right on Mari Guatira's head. You should know, senor, she'd be no good as a queen. Countess would suit her better, but even then she'd need God and plenty of help." "Leave it in the hands of God, Sancho," responded Don Quixote, "for he will give her what best suits her. But do not shrink your spirit such as you come to settle for less than conqueror." "I won't, senor," said Sancho, "especially with such a principled master as your grace, who will know to give me just what suits me best and nothing I can't handle." Chapter 8. On the excellent incident of Don Quixote's harrowing and unimaginable adventure with the windmills, along with other occurrences worthy of fond remembrance. Chapter 8. As they were talking, they rode past some 30 or 40 of the windmills that are so common in that part of the countryside. As soon as Don Quixote saw them, he said to his squire, "Fortune is guiding our affairs better than we could even have hoped. For over there, Sancho Panza, my friend, you will see there are 30 or more titanic giants." Ooh. I almost said gigantic titans, but no. The words are titanic giants. "And I intend to do battle with and slay each and every one. We will begin to amass our fortune with the spoils we strip from them, for our war is righteous, and we do a great service to God by wiping such an evil race off the face of the earth." "What giants?" asked Sancho Panza. "Those that you see over there," replied his master, "with the long arms. Some giants are known to have arms that stretch almost 2 leagues in length." "Look, your grace," responded Sancho, "those things you see over there aren't giants, they're windmills. And the things that look like arms are the sails that move the millstone when they spin in the wind." "Clearly," replied Don Quixote, "you are poorly versed in adventures. Those are giants, and if you are afraid, stand back and pray while I ride forth to meet them in fierce and unequaled combat." As he said this, he spurred his horse, Rocinante, and ignored Sancho's shouts as he tried to warn his master that, beyond a shadow of a doubt, the things he was charging were not giants, but windmills. Nevertheless, Don Quixote was so set on them being giants, he closed his ears to Sancho's shouts and didn't bother to look, even when he was quite close, to see for himself what they were. Instead, he bailed out, "Flee not, you vile and cowardly creatures, for it is but a single knight who attacks you." Just then the wind kicked up a bit, and the massive sails began to move. Seeing this, Don Quixote cried, "You can flail more arms than the giant Briareus, and still I shall make you pay." Shouting this, and entrusting himself wholeheartedly to his lady Dulcinea, whom he implored to favour him in this tribulation, he shielded himself with his round buckler, locked his lance into position, rallied Rocinante into a gallop, and charged the closest windmill. He stabbed it in the sail, which the wind whipped round with such a fury that his lance snapped in half, sending both horse and knight flying. Don Quixote went rolling off a ways into the field, bruised and battered. Sancho Panza went over to help, as fast as his ass could take him. And when he got to his side, Sancho found Don Quixote unable to move, for in their fall Rocinante had nearly squashed him. "Valeme Dios!" cried Sancho. "Didn't I tell your grace to watch what you were doing? They're nothing but windmills, and only somebody with windmills for brains could miss that." "Peace, Sancho, my friend," replied Don Quixote, "for in war, especially, things are always shifting. What's more, I think, and so it is true, that sage Freston who stole my books in my library must have turned these giants into windmills to steal from me the glory of defeating them. Such is the enmity he bears me. But in the end his evil arts shall be no match for the righteousness of my blade." "God willing," replied Sancho Panza. Sancho helped Don Quixote up, and he climbed back onto Rocinante, whose saddle had slid significantly sideways. And as they talked over their recent adventure, they got back on the road to Puerto La Peace, for Don Quixote said they couldn't help but find many different adventures there, with so many people passing through. But still, he was quite gloomy over the loss of his lance. Turning to a squire, he said, "I remember reading about a Spanish knight named Diego Perez de Vargas, who, having broken his sword in battle, ripped a heavy branch or trunk off an oak. With it he performed such feats, mashing and mauling so many Moors, that they added Machuca to his name. And from that day forward he and all his descendants were known as Vargas y Machuca. I have told you this because as soon as I see an oak or an elm, I plan to tear off another trunk exactly as excellent as I imagine Vargas y Machuca was. And with it I plan to perform such deeds as you will consider yourself fortunate indeed to be deemed worthy to see, and witness such incredible feats as can barely be believed." "With God's help," said Sancho, "I believe it'll all be just as you say, your grace. But straighten up a little, for it seems you're sliding halfway off your horse, probably on account of your fall." "That is true," responded Don Quixote, "or if I do not complain of the pain, it is because knights-errant are not wont to complain of their wounds, even those which disgorge their very guts." "If that's the case, I won't argue," replied Sancho, "but Lord knows I'd rather your grace complain when something's hurting. Me, I've known to complain about even the slightest pain, assuming squires don't also have to follow the non-complaining rule." Don Quixote burst out in laughter at the simplicity of his squire. He declared Sancho was welcome to complain whenever and however he wished, reluctantly or eagerly, as he'd never read of anything to the contrary in the order of chivalry. Sancho said it was time for lunch, and his master declined, saying that at that moment he had no need for food, but that Sancho should eat whenever he pleased. Permission granted, Sancho did his best to adapt to lunch on donkey back. Pulling out of the saddlebags what he'd put into them, he rode along behind his master, munching contentedly. Every so often he took a swig from his wineskin with such gusto and evident delight that he could have drawn the envy even of Malaga's most refined palates. Sancho rode along, sipping on wine without a care in the world, not even remembering the promises his master had made him, for it seemed to him it was less a job and more a vacation to ride off in search of adventures, however dangerous they might be. And so they spent the night in a grove of trees. Don Quixote tore down a dry branch that could almost serve as a lance, and put the iron tip from the broken lance on the end of it. He stayed up all night thinking about his lady, Dulcinea, just like he'd read about in his books, where many knights spent many a night, sleepless in forests and empty fields, wrapped up in memories of their lady loves. Sancho Panza did not follow suit. He had filled his belly, and was not with and not with chicory tea either, so he slept all night long. If his master had woken him, he would have happily slept through. If his master hadn't woken him, he would have happily slept through the first rays of sun shining on his face, and quite a plentiful number of birds tweeting with great exuberance as they greeted the new day. Getting up, Sancho gave the wineskin a squeeze and found it significantly less full than the night before, which hurt his heart, for it didn't seem likely that the road they were taking would lead somewhere he could fill it back up any time soon. Don Quixote didn't want to eat breakfast because, as mentioned earlier, he was set on nourishing himself with nothing but delicious memories. They got back on the road to Puerto La Peace, where they arrived around 3 in the afternoon. "Here," said Don Quixote, surveying the town, "Sancho Panza, my brother, we can plunge ourselves up to our elbows in this thing called adventure. But I caution you, even if you see me in the greatest danger in all the world, you are not to put a hand to your sword in my defense, unless you see that those who offend me are low-born riffraff, in which case you may very well help me. But if they are knights, it is in no way permissible, nor permitted by the laws of chivalry, for you to help me, unless you yourself are dubbed a knight." "Of course, senor," replied Sancho. "I'll obey your grace completely. What's more, by your part, I'm a peaceable man. For my part, I'm a peaceable man. I'm opposed to getting myself in any arguments or brawls, though it's plenty true that as far as protecting myself goes, I won't pay much attention to those laws, since the laws of God and man both say we're allowed to defend ourselves against anybody trying to hurt us." "I do not disagree," replied Don Quixote, "but as far as assisting me against knights, you must restrain your natural impulses." "I said I would," responded Sancho. "I'll follow your decree as faithfully as rest on Sundays." As they discussed this, 2 Benedictine monks came riding down the road on 2 camels. Or at least their mules were big enough to be camels, all wrapped up for the road, with traveling spectacles and sunshades. Behind them was a carriage accompanied by 4 or 5 riders and 2 mule boys on foot. Inside the carriage, as was later discovered, was a Basque lady traveling to Sevilla to meet her husband, who was setting sail for the Indies, having been appointed for a post of some distinction. The monks were not with her, though they were traveling down the same road, and as soon as Don Quixote caught sight of them, he said to his squire, "If I am not mistaken, this shall be the most famous adventure ever seen, for those dark shapes over there seem to be, and so without a doubt are, some wizards who have kidnapped the princess in that carriage. I must right this wrong with all my might." "This is going to be worse than the windmills," said Sancho. "Look, senor, those are Benedictine monks, and the carriage must belong to some other travelers. Look, I'm telling you, look carefully at what you're doing. You wouldn't want the devil to fool you." "I've already told you, Sancho," replied Don Quixote, "how little you know on the subject of adventuring. What I say is true, as you soon shall see." Saying this, he rode on ahead and positioned himself in the middle of the road, not far from the monks. Once he believed them to be within earshot, he shouted, "Bedeviled and irregular people, release the high-born princesses you hold captive in that carriage at once. Otherwise, prepare yourselves for imminent death as such punishments for your wicked deeds." The monks pulled back on their reins, as astonished by Don Quixote's appearance as by his words, to which they replied, "Señor Knight, we are neither bedeviled nor irregular, merely 2 holy men of San Benito traveling this road. We have no idea whether or not that carriage holds any captive princesses." "Your mealy-mouthed words mean nothing to me, for I know you truly are faithless riffraff," replied Don Quixote. And without waiting for a reply, he spurred Rocinante, lowered his lance, and charged at the first monk with such fury and daring that if the monk hadn't slid off his mule, he would have been knocked quite unpleasantly to the ground, or perhaps even gravely wounded if not struck dead. The second monk, seeing the treatment his companion received, gave a kick to his castle of a mule and fled into the countryside faster than the wind itself. Seeing the monk on the ground, Sancho Panza hopped off his ass, went over and began to strip off his habit. As he pulled off the monk's clothes, the 2 mule boys came over and asked Sancho what exactly he thought he was doing, stripping their master down to his skivvies. Sancho told him the habit was rightfully his, as spoils of the battle as Señor Don Quixote had just won. The mule boys, who had no head for jokes and didn't understand this business of spoils and battles, saw Don Quixote had gone off to speak to the people in the carriage, so they lunged at Sancho and knocked him to the ground. They kicked him to a pulp and left him lying there without a hair left in his beard, knocked out and winded. Without missing a beat, the monk, who was terrified and timorous and pale in the face, got back atop his mule. As soon as he was in the saddle, he took off after his companion, who was waiting for him a good way off, staying out of harm's reach until the danger passed. The second monk caught up to the first, and with no desire to wait and watch the rest of the incident unfold, they took off immediately, riding away and crossing themselves more than if the devil himself were at their backs. Don Quixote, as indicated earlier, was speaking with the lady of the carriage, saying, "Señora, thy beauteousness is free to dispose of thy person in accordance with thy whim, for thine arrogant captives lie fallen on the ground, toppled by the strength of this mine arm. Pine not to know the name of thy liberator, but know rather that I am Don Quixote of La Mancha, knight-errant and adventurer, captive of the peerless and beautiful Donna Dulcinea de Boso, and in payment for the beneficence I have bestowed on you, I ask nothing more than for you to return to de Boso and present yourself before that lady on my behalf, and describe to her the great deeds by which I have secured thy liberty." Don Quixote's every word was heard by one of the Basque squires accompanying the carriage. When he realized Don Quixote intended to prevent the carriage from continuing along, wanting them instead to turn back towards Toboso, he approached the knight and grabbing him by the lance, told him in bad Spanish, and even worse Basque, the following: "Go on, knight, you go wrong. By God, my crater, if you don't pass carriage, so I be Basque, so you be dead." Don Quixote understood him perfectly, and he calmly replied, "If you were a knight, which you are not, I would already have punished you for your idiocy and your impertinence, you captive creature." To which the Basque replied, "I not knight, I swear God, so I be Christian." "So you lie. If lance you thrust and sword unsheath, we see how quick cat take to water. Basque by birth, noble by seed, knight by devil, otherwise says liar." "We'll see about that," cried Agraje, replied Don Quixote. And throwing his lance to the ground, he unsheathed his sword, strapped on his shield, and charged the Basque, determined to take his life. The Basque, seeing him coming, would have preferred to dismount his mule, since it was one of those rented mules you can never trust, but there was no time to do anything other than to draw his sword. As luck would have it, he happened to be right next to the carriage, so he reached in and grabbed a cushion to serve as a shield, and then the two of them went at each other like mortal enemies. Everyone else tried to stop them, but they could not, because the Basque declared in his tongue-twisted terms that if they didn't let him finish his battle, he'd kill his mistress himself along with anyone else who got in his way. The lady of the carriage, amazed and afraid of what she was seeing, had the coachman move the carriage a way off. From afar she watched the two go through their rigorous bout, during which the Basque took such a mighty chop at one of Don Quixote's shoulders that had it not hit his shield, it would have sliced him open all the way down to his waist. Don Quixote, feeling the force of that frenzied blow, began to shout at the top of his lungs, "O lady of my soul, Dulcinea, blossom beauteousness, come to the aid of this thy knight, who, to satisfy you and win your favor, finds himself facing much demanding danger." He shouted this, grasped his sword, shielded himself with his buckler, and charged the Basque all at once, determined to bet it all in one blow. The Basque, seeing Don Quixote charge him, understood his rage, and thus his daring, and so he too went all in, shielding himself with his cushion, unable to move the mule, who, exhausted and unimpressed with his childishness, refused to take a single step. Well, as previously mentioned, Don Quixote was charging at the wary Basque, sword raised over his head, determined to split him in half. And the Basque awaited him with his own sword raised, shielding himself with his cushion. And everyone watching was on edge, hanging on their every move, afraid of what would happen when these two terrible blows finally met. And the lady of the carriage and her handmaids were praying and making 1,000 vows and promising offerings to every holy image and house of worship in all of Spain, if only God would save them and their squire from the great danger they were facing. The trouble is, exactly at that point, after those very words, the author leaves the story of this battle hanging, apologizing that he could not find any more written on the above-mentioned deeds of Don Quixote. It is quite true that the second author of this work didn't want to believe such a curious story could be lost to the ages, nor that the wits of La Mancha should be so incurious that among their archives or piled on their desks there wouldn't be at least a few pages dealing with this famous knight. And thus, imagining it so, he did not despair over being unable to find the end of this mild-mannered story, which, since heaven was on his side, found its way to him, as shall be described in the second part. Second part of the ingenious gentleman Don Quixote of La Mancha. Which concludes and completes the tale of the stupendous battle between the brave Basque and the valiant Manchegan. The first part of this story left off with the valiant Basque and the legendary Don Quixote staring each other down, their naked blades raised in the air, about to unleash upon each other two furious blows, which, had they landed full force, would have, at the very least, sliced each of them open and split them down the middle like pomegranates. And right at that moment, at the height of suspense, this delectable story cut off, truncated, with no word from its author on where to find the rest of it. This filled me with dismay, for my delight at beginning the story soon turned to disgruntlement to the thought of the hard road that lay ahead to find the missing part of this toothsome tale. To me it seemed impossible and quite beyond the pale to think such a fine knight could have been bereft of such sage to take on the task of writing down his never-before-seen deeds. For no knight-errant of the kind, as folks say, with adventures in mind, had ever been so deprived before. It was standard issue for each and every one of them to have at least one sage, if not two, not only to write down their deeds, but to detail their every thought and idiocy, no matter how carefully concealed. All right, now we're getting into it. As such, a knight simply could not have been so misfortunate as to go without what Plato and the rest had in spades. Thus I could not bring myself to believe such a gallant story would truly be left like that, amputated and armless and maimed, and so I blamed the malevolence of time, devourer and digester of all things, which had either concealed the rest of Don Quixote's history or consumed it. On the other hand, it seemed to me, since his library held such modern texts as Jealous Disenchantments and Nymphs and Shepherds of Henares, pastoral novels by Cervantes' contemporaries, published in the 1580s, that it must be fairly recent history, and even if it hadn't been written down, it would still live in the memories of the people of his town and others nearby. I was stirred as I imagined this, filled with desire to really and truly know the entirety of the life and miracles of our famous Spaniard, Don Quixote of La Mancha, that shining light, that mirror of Manchegan chivalry. For he was the first of our era, in these calamitous times, to dedicate himself to the role and profession of errant knighthood, righting wrongs, comforting widows, helping damsels, especially the kind riding wild on a palfrey, her whip and her virginity at her side, travelling from valley to valley and peak to peak. And unless some scoundrel or some villain with a cap and an axe, or some colossal giant forces himself upon her, well, there have been damsels who have made it to 80 without spending a single night indoors, and gone to the grave as intact as the mothers who bore them. And so what I mean to say is that in this and many other regards our gallant Don Quixote is worthy of continual and memorable praise, which you shouldn't deny me either on account of my hard work and diligence in hunting down the end of this enjoyable story, although I am well aware that without the help of heaven, fortune, and circumstance, the world would have been bereft of the almost 2 hours of entertainment and amusement awaiting the careful reader. So, this is how it happened. I was in the Alcana market in Toledo one day when a boy came by selling old papers to silk makers. Since I love to read, even if it's torn up pages on the street, I was spurred by my natural inclination to pick up one of the folios the boy was selling, and on it I saw a script I knew to be Arabic. Since I can recognize the language, but I can't read it, I went around looking for a Morisco who spoke Spanish and could read the Arabic script to me. It was not hard to find such an interpreter, for even if I had been looking for help with a still older and better language, I could have found it there. Yet short luck led me to one, and once I told him my wishes and put the book in his hands, he opened it up at random, began reading, and burst out laughing. I asked him what he was laughing at, and he told me it was an annotation in the margin of the book. I told him to read it to me, and through his laughter he said, "Here, like I told you, in the annotation it is said that this Dulcinea of Toboso, so often referenced in the present history, cured pork better than any woman in La Mancha." When I heard Dulcinea of Toboso, I was shaken and stirred, for I immediately realized those folios held the history of Don Quixote. Imagining it so, I urged the Morisco to read to me from the beginning. He did as I asked, turning the Arabic to Spanish as he went, and told me it said, "History of Don Quixote of La Mancha, written by Cid Hamet Benengeli, Arab historian." It took a great deal of discretion on my part to hide my happiness when I heard the book's title. Before the silkmaker could get the chance, I bought up all the boy's papers and folios for half a real. If the boy had been a bit sharper and known how much I wanted them, he would have done better for himself, because I would have spent 6 reals just to get my hands on them. I drew the Morisco aside into the cloister of the main church and begged him to rewrite the papers, all of which were about Don Quixote in Spanish, without leaving anything out or putting anything in, telling him he could name his price. He was content with 2 arabas of raisins and 2 bushels of wheat, promising he would translate it all faithfully and quickly and very well. But I, as much to facilitate our agreement as to avoid letting such an excellent find out of my hands, brought him to my house, where in just over a month and a half he translated it all exactly as it appears here. The first folio had a very realistic painting of the battle between Don Quixote and the Basque facing off, just as the story describes, with their swords raised high, one shielding himself with his buckler, and the other with his cushion. The Basque's mule was so lifelike that you could tell it was a rental from a stone's throw away. At the Basque's feet was an inscription which read, "To Sancho of Azpeitia," which must surely have been his name, and at Rocinante's feet was another reading Don Quixote. Rocinante was marvelously rendered, so stretched out and saggy, so scrawny and thin, that you could even see his spine right through his skin. He looked so consumptive, it was clear how properly and accurately he'd been named Rocinante. Sancho Panza was next to him, holding his ass by the halter. At his feet was another inscription reading Sancho Zacchus. And I should say the illustration shows he was short, with a great big gut and long shanks, which explains why the story sometimes refers to him as Sancho Panza, or Sancho the Gut, or sometimes as Sancho Zancus, or Sancho Shanks. There were a few other details worth noticing, but none very important or relevant to the truthful telling of this story, which, like all stories, cannot be bad, so long as it is true. If any objection can be made as to the truth of this history, it could only be that its author was an Arab, as the people of that nation are quite prone to lying. However, given that they are our sworn enemies, it stands to reason that its author would have been much more likely to say too little rather than too much. And so it seems to me that when opportunities arise to extend his pen in praise of such a fine knight, this historian passes over them in silence, seemingly on purpose. This is poorly done and worse thought out, for those who tell the tale of history should be precise, truthful, and utterly dispassionate, such that neither favor nor fear, rancor, nor predilections twist their path away from the truth, whose mother is history, mirror of time, archive of all actions, witness to the past, role model and cautionary tale for the present, and forewarning for what's to come. In these pages, I show we shall find everything we could wish for in the finest of stories, and if something good is missing, what I would say is blame it on the dog who wrote it rather than ascribing any fault to its subject. And so, according to the translation, the second part begins like this. Sharpened blades unsheathed and raised against the sky, the two valiant enraged foes seemed to threaten heaven, earth, and the abyss. Such was their boldness and their bearing, and the first to loose a blow was the belligerent Basque, who slashed down with such a strength and fury that if his sword hadn't turned on the way downward, with that single blow he would have put an end to the rigorous bout and ended all the knight's adventures. But Fortune, who was saving Don Quixote for greater things, twisted his foe's sword in the air, so that even though the blow landed on Don Quixote's left shoulder, no harm befell him, beyond the left half of his armor falling off, along with most of his helmet and half his ear, all of which clanged frightfully to the ground, leaving him in very bad shape indeed. Valeme Dios, who could possibly describe precisely the rage that filled Manchegan's heart, seeing himself treated this way. Suffice it to say, he straightened himself in his stirrups, gripped his sword with both hands, and furiously slashed at the Basque, the blow landing squarely on his cushion and his head. The cushion wasn't much protection. It was as if a mountain had fallen atop him. He started bleeding from his nose, and his mouth and his ears swaying like he was about to fall off his mule, and doubtless he would have if he hadn't locked his arms round its neck. But with all that, the Basque's feet had slipped out of his stirrups, and he had to let go of the neck of the mule, who, spooked by the terrifying blow, took off into the countryside, managing, after just a few bucks, to dump his rider on the ground. Don Quixote watched all this quite calmly. Once he saw that his foe had fallen, he hopped off his horse and bound over to the Basque, putting the tip of his sword between the Basque's eyes and telling him to surrender, or else he would cut off his head. The Basque was so perturbed that he could not speak a word, and things would have gone quite badly for him, given how blinded by rage Don Quixote was, if the ladies of the carriage, who had been watching the bout with great dismay up to that point, had not gone over and begged Don Quixote desperately and earnestly to do them the great mercy in favor of pardoning their squire and sparing his life. To whom Don Quixote replied, intoning gravely with great gravitas, "Of course, beauteous ladies, I am happy to do as you ask, but there must be one condition and commitment, which is that this knight must promise me he shall go to this village of Toboso and present himself on my behalf to the peerless Donna Dulcinea, so that she may dispose of him as per her whim." The lady, frightened and distraught without understanding what Don Quixote was demanding, or bothering to ask who Dulcinea was, promised her squire would do exactly as instructed. "Then with thy word as bond, I shall do him no further harm, despite what he deserves." Chapter 10. On what further befell Don Quixote with the Basque, and how he was put in peril by a posse of Yanguesans. This chapter heading may reflect Cervantes' last-minute changes to his text, because the adventure with the Basque is over, and the Yanguesans, who are natives of the town of Yanguas, don't appear until later in the text. By that point, Sancho Panza was back on his feet, albeit a bit battered by the mule boys. As he watched Don Quixote's battle, he begged God from the bottom of his heart to send his lord victory and let him win an insula to give to Sancho to govern, like he promised. Well, seeing the quarrel was over and his master was about to remount Rocinante, Sancho went over to hold his stirrup. Before Don Quixote could mount up, Sancho knelt before his master. He grabbed his hand and kissed it as he said, "My good Señor Don Quixote, may it serve your grace to make me governor of the insula you have just won in this rigorous bout, however big it might be, for I believe that I have what it takes to govern it, as much and as well as anybody else who's ever governed an insula." To which Don Quixote responded, "Mark, brother Sancho, that this adventure and others like it are not insula adventures, but crossroads adventures, in which nothing is won beyond a broken head or an absent ear. Have patience. Adventures shall present themselves to us that will allow me to not only make you a governor, but to advance your station even further. Sancho thanked him profusely, bending down again to kiss Don Quixote's hand and the hem of his chainmail. He helped him up onto Rocinante, then climbed atop his ass and followed along. I can't never laugh at that. That is so funny. Followed along after his master, who took off like a shot into the forest lining the road, without bothering to say goodbye or anything else to the ladies in the carriage. Sancho followed behind him at his donkey's fastest trot, but Rocinante was so much faster that Sancho fell behind and had to call to his master to wait. Don Quixote did so, pulling back on Rocinante's reins until his tired squire could catch up. As soon as he did, Sancho said, "Seems to me, senor, it'd be a good idea for us to hole up and take refuge in a church, because the man you battled ended up so battered it wouldn't take much for the Holy Brotherhood to catch word and come after us. And if they do, by my faith, we'd be sweating through our beards before we make it out of jail." "Peace," said Don Quixote. "For when have you ever seen or read of a knight-errant being brought to justice, no matter how many times he committed homicide?" "Homicide? I wouldn't know. Not seen that in my life. But I do know the Holy Brotherhood arrests anybody caught fighting in the countryside. As far as setting homicide, that's no business of mine." "Fear not, friend," replied Don Quixote, "for I shall save you from the very hands of Babylon, let alone the Brotherhood. But on your life, tell me, have you ever seen a knight as valiant as I in all that has scoured well? Have you ever read in any of the histories of another with such boldness and daring, with such long-winded perseverance, such skill in causing injury, such talent for triumph?" "Truthfully," responded Sancho, "I've never read a single history, because I don't know how to read or write. But I'd go so far as to bet I've never served a master bolder than your grace in all the days of my life. And God grant we don't end up paying for that boldness like I said, but I beg you, your grace, at least tend to your ear. It's bleeding a lot. I have bandages and a bit of healing salve in the saddlebags." "We wouldn't need any of that," replied Don Quixote, "if I could remember how to craft a flask of the balm of Fierabras. For with no more than a drop, we'd save ourselves both time and medicine." "Well, what flask and what balm is that?" asked Sancho Panza. "It is a balm," replied Don Quixote, "whose recipe resides in my memory. With it one needs have no fear of death, nor worry over wounds. Thus, once I've concocted it and entrusted it to you, if you see in battle that I've been chopped in half, as often occurs, all you must do is gently pick up the section of me that's fallen to the ground and place it swiftly before the blood begins to set atop the half, still in the saddle, making sure to line up everything correctly and settle everything evenly. Then you have only to bring the balm I described to my lips and tip in 2 swallows. You shall see how it restores me, leaving me fit as a fiddle once more." "If that exists," said Panza, "I'll give up governing the insula you promised right here and now, and all I want in payment for my extensive and excellent service is for your grace to give me the recipe of that exceptional potion. Because if you ask me, an ounce would be worth more than 2 reals anywhere you please, and that's all I need to live a life of honor and of ease. Though now I need to know how much it costs to make it." "It costs less than 3 reals to concoct 3 azumbras of balm," said Don Quixote. "Sinner that I am," cried Sancho. "What is your grace waiting for? Go on and concoct it and show me how." "Quiet, friend," replied Don Quixote, "for I plan to show you even greater secrets than this and bestow upon you even greater mercies. As for now, let's tend to my ear, for it is more painful than I would prefer." Sancho pulled the bandages and salves out of the saddlebag, but when Don Quixote noticed that his headpiece was broken, he thought about losing his mind. With one hand on the hilt of his sword, he raised his eyes to the skies, shouting, "I vow, before the Creator of all things and the 4 holy Gospels and all described therein, that I shall do as the great Marquis of Mantua did when he swore to avenge his nephew Voldivinos, vowing to forego breaking bread at tables set with fine linens, and dallying with his woman, and other things which I do not recall, but hereby consider enumerated, until I take full vengeance upon he who did commit this crime unto my person." Hearing this, Sancho said, "Look, your grace, Signor Don Quixote, if that knight obeyed your command and went and presented himself before my lady Dulcinea of Toboso, he'll have served his sentence. He doesn't deserve another punishment unless he commits another crime." "You have spoken well, and your point is made," replied Don Quixote, "and thus I hereby annul my vow insofar as the taking of new vengeance. But I still recommit to and affirm my vow to live as I have said until an opportunity arise to forcibly seize another helmet of the same style and caliber from some passing knight. And do not, Sancho, I am being hasty, and do not think, Sancho, I am being hasty or burning hay in this, for I have a fine example to imitate. The very same thing to the letter with the helm of Mambrino, for which Sacripante paid so dearly." "To hell with those vows, Señor your grace," replied Sancho. "They're terrible for your health and toxic for your conscience. Or else tell me what happens if we don't see anyone wearing armor and a headpiece. Then what do we do? We'll still have to follow the vow and keep doing all those inconvenient, uncomfortable things like sleeping with our clothes on and never spending a night in town and the 1,000 of other kinds of penance in that crazy wild Marquis Mantua's vow that your grace wants to recommit to now. Look, your grace, men in armor don't travel these roads, just mule drivers and merchants with carts, who not only don't wear headpieces, they've probably never heard of a headpiece in their whole lives." "You are mistaken," said Don Quixote. "For before 2 hours passes at these crossroads, more armed men will go by than all who charge the Albraca to conquer Angelica the Beautiful." "All right, fine, it'll be like you say," said Sancho. "God grant things start going well for us. Let's hurry up and win this insula I'm paying for so dearly, and then I can die." "I've told you, Sancho, not to worry about that. For even should we not acquire insula, there remains the kingdoms of Denmark and Surbadisa, which would fit like a ring on your finger. Moreover, they would please you even more than the insula, for they are on terra firma. But let us not set this aside for now. Investigate the saddlebags to see if there's anything to eat, so that we may swiftly begin our search for a castle wherein to spend the night, and concoct the balm I mentioned, for I swear here before you and God, my ear is hurting quite a lot." I have got an onion in here, plus a hunk of cheese, and I don't know how many crusts of bread," said Sancho. "But then all the delicacies of a knight like your grace deserves." "How little you understand chivalry," replied Don Quixote. "I'll have you know, Sancho, that it is a point of honor for knight-errants to go an entire month without eating anything at all. And when they do eat, it is merely what they have at hand. And you should know this to be true if you had read as many histories as I. Furthermore, in the very many I have read, there has not been a single description of a knight-errant eating in any way except for the occasional sumptuous banquet thrown in their honor. The rest of the time they lived off thin air. And though they understand they could not fully refrain from eating and all the other bodily necessities, for in effect they were men like us, we also understand they spent most of their lives in dense forests or deserted fields, and they didn't bring cooks with them. Thus their most frequent food would have been rustic viands, such as the ones you offer me now. Therefore, Sancho, my friend, be not vexed with Vereri over what I prefer, for you should not seek to make the world anew, nor knock the order of errant chivalry off its hinges." "Forgive me, your grace," said Sancho, "since I don't know how to read or write. Like I told you before, I never heard or learned the rules of the profession of chivalry. From here on out, I'll be sure to stock the saddlebags with all kinds of dried fruits and nuts for your grace, since you're a knight. And as for me, since I'm not, I'll get more fine-feathered filling food." "I'm not saying, Sancho," replied Don Quixote, "that knight-errant was required to subsist solely on fruits and nuts, as you say, but rather that their most frequent sustenance must have been such, along with certain herbs and greens that they were, and I am, familiar with, for they foraged from the fields." "Good things," said Sancho. "Your grace knows those herbs and greens. The way we're going, one of these days I imagine we'll be needing them." As he spoke, he pulled what he had mentioned out of the saddlebags, and the two of them ate peacefully in good company. Wanting to start searching for somewhere to spend the night, they finished up their poor, dry meal quickly, then mounted up and hurried off, hoping to find a town before nightfall. But just as the last rays of sunshine and their hopes of reaching their goal were slipping away, they came upon the huts of some goat herds and decided to spend the night there. Sancho's sorrow at not reaching town was as vast as was his master's pleasure at sleeping under the open sky, for it seemed to Don Quixote that each time he did so, he staked a further claim in proof of his chivalry.